to our discussion of the Garden of the Righteous documentary. My name is Marty Lewis Hunstiger, and I'm honored to be the moderator of this panel of scholars who will discuss the documentary Honoring the Righteous Among the Nations and explore ways in which we can emulate their brave actions today. Gitl Eisner, founder of Naye Strunes, would like to extend a personal welcome to you. Gitl?
My name is Gitl Eisner. I created the concept for Garden of the Righteous and composed the music, which you will hear performed by Naye Strunes Klezmer Quartet. It is my privilege, speaking on behalf of all who continue to work generously on this project, to thank you, our listeners, for watching both the video documentary and our discussion today. The Holocaust, or Shoah as it is known in Hebrew, or Herb as it is known in Yiddish, began over 80 years ago as a horrible delusion of human consciousness, which manifested into a massive tragedy which lasted for about a decade. Today, we still feel its impact, and it continues to baffle our minds as to why it happened, how it happened, and whether or not it could happen again. I want to thank each scholar on the panel for looking at the Holocaust from their unique perspective and area of expertise. Through the process of exchanging ideas, they will create a web of deeper understanding and intersecting ideas, offering more thoughts for us to ponder. It is our intention that you will take from the discussion fresh ways of seeing yourself, not merely as an inheritor of the past, but as an active creator of the future. If there is one universal lesson to be gleaned from the tragedy of the Holocaust, it may be this. During our short lives, we must avoid being bystanders. We have individual and collective responsibility to be allies in alleviating suffering in whatever method we feel capable. I want to thank Marty Lewis Hunstiger, our moderator, Stu Janis, our webinar technician, and each panelist. And now, let our discussion begin.
Thank you, Gitl. I'm honored to introduce our panel of scholars. Riane Eisler holds a Bachelor of Arts in Sociology from the University of California at Los Angeles, a Juris Doctor from that university's School of Law, and Honorary Doctor of Humane Letters degrees from the Saybrook Institute and Case Western Reserve University. She's president of the Center for Partnership Studies, editor-in-chief of the Interdisciplinary Journal of Partnership Studies, and author of The Chalice and the Blade, Our History, Our Future, Sacred Pleasure, Tomorrow's Children, The Power of Partnership, The Real Wealth of Nations, Creating a Caring Economics, and Nurturing Our Humanity, How Domination and Partnership Shape Our Brains, Lives, and Future, co-authored with Douglas Fry. She keynotes conferences worldwide and consults for governments on the partnership model. She has written more than 500 articles for publications, including the Christian Science Monitor, Human Rights Quarterly, Forbes, and the International Journal of Women's Studies. Welcome, Riane.
Thank you.
Catherine Agnes Heather holds a Master of Arts in Musicology from the University of Minnesota and a Master of Arts in Religious Studies from the University of Colorado at Boulder. She's a doctoral dissertation fellow in historical musicology and ethnomusicology at the University of Minnesota, Twin Cities. Her dissertation examines the myriad of Holocaust voices, specifically for sonic qualities and their resulting effects. Welcome, Catherine. Dennis Peters is a member of the Unitarian Society of Menominee, Wisconsin, and completed a long career in information technology in 2015. He holds a Bachelor of Science in Trumpet Performance from the University of Wisconsin, River Falls, and a Master of Arts in Religious Leadership with emphasis in interfaith chaplaincy from United Theological Seminary in St. Paul, Minnesota, and uses that background to participate in leadership roles, including supporting members with illnesses, leading services, and conducting life celebrations. Welcome, Dennis. Hannah Wilson is a graduate of the Weiss Livnat International Master of Arts Program in Holocaust Studies at the University of Haifa, Israel. In 2016, she began PhD research on the material memory of Sobibor in the Department of History at Nottingham Trent University in the UK, funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council Midlands for Cities Award. She is a former European Holocaust Research Infrastructure Fellow, and from 2014 on, she has participated in research at the archaeological excavations at Sobibor and Treblinka campsites in Poland. In 2019, she was awarded a research grant by the Fondation pour la Mémoire de la Shoah in Paris. And I'm Marty Lewis Hunstiger. I have a Bachelor of Science in Nursing from the University of Maryland Walter Reed Extension and a Master of Arts in Communication Studies from the University of Minnesota. I'm a retired pediatric nurse and preceptor, editor-in-chief of Creative Nursing, a scholarly peer-reviewed journal for healthcare professionals, and a member of the editorial board of the Interdisciplinary Journal of Partnership Studies. I'm a presenter in the Garden of the Righteous documentary video and a co-authored a scholarly article, Righteous Among the Nations, Music Without Borders, with Gitl Eisner and my daughter Gretta Hunstiger, who plays fiddle in Naye Strunes. I'd like to acknowledge Janis, who plays tsimbl in Naye Strunes and is our invaluable Zoom tech support person for this recorded discussion today. Our conversation today is organized around 4 topics that are relevant to the actions of the righteous among the nations: the political and social position of Jewish people in Europe historically, but with an emphasis on the 20th century; the nature of the Ashkenazic culture that was nearly eradicated, including the role of music and the ethos it represented in relation to persecution; the sociocultural structure of Nazism, its perpetuation through the framing of narratives and through parenting practices, and the actions of the righteous as countercultural; and the concept of allyship, as exemplified by the righteous toward the Jews during the Holocaust, and in actions by righteous people that are needed today in aid of endangered and marginalized individuals and communities. So we begin our discussion by focusing on the people who became the major target of the Holocaust, the Jewish people living in Europe. Jewish people as a group and individuals have been marginalized, endangered, and scapegoated for centuries. Dennis, will you start us out on this discussion?
Sure. Thanks, Marty. To condense a couple of thousand years of history down to a few sentences, Jews ended up in Europe as a result of massive, ongoing, multicultural attacks against them. In a lot of cases, they were running for their lives. They were never allowed permanently to be a member of society anywhere. Assimilation was an occasional dream, usually turned into a nightmare by the next king or prince. From Spain to Russia, their treatment by Christianity, mostly, was typified by pogroms, internment camps, burning at the stake, torture. Popes and councils led the charge. Pope Innocent III in 1215 required Jews and Muslims to wear clothing setting them apart. This happened multiple times through the centuries. Pope Julius III in 1553 ordered the burning of Jewish books in Rome, possibly including about 12,000 copies of the Talmud. This book burning also happened many times with incalculable loss to the world. And even back to 380 CE, Pseudo-Gregory wrote, Jews were murderers of the Lord, assassins of the prophets, rebels and detesters of God, companions of the devils, a race of vipers. And coming closer to the present, Pope Pius XII in World War II maintained a status of neutrality, clearly knowing about the death camps, the atrocities. I would make the point that a basic influence in hatred of Jews has been the difference from the predominant culture. A different look and different customs seem always to be a focal point for hatred. And this was also a circular process. Make them stand out by wearing different clothing or emblems, then attack them for being different. We can look at today's world and see that reaction to Muslims in the US, or even those who look Muslim. Sikhs have been killed because they look Muslim. Note the attack on the Sikh Gurdwara in Oak Creek, Wisconsin in 2012. I grew up Lutheran. I can tell you that one of the strongest anti-Semitic influences on the Nazis was Martin Luther. Hitler praised him in Mein Kampf, and Nazi pamphlets quoted his 1543 treatise on the Jews and their lies. He said in part, "Set fire to their synagogues or schools and bury and cover with dirt whatever will not burn. All their prayer books and Talmudic writings in which such idolatry, lies, cursing, and blasphemy are taught, be taken from them. Rabbis be forbidden to teach henceforth on pain of loss of life and limb." These quotes and others were in the pamphlets, the Nazi pamphlets, and were directly responsible for Kristallnacht. We'll be maybe talking more about him later. Okay, I'll be quiet now and let someone else talk.
Well, so who would like to enter this conversation first? Rian, I know as a Holocaust survivor, this is a whole subject that's close to your heart.
Well, it's very close to my heart, and it almost cost me my life. We were very fortunate, my parents and I. We escaped my native Vienna by a hair's breadth. And I want to add to what Dennis said, that number one, if you read the history of Jews during the 2,000 or so years since the birth of Jesus, it's a horror story. I mean, Jews, for example, were permitted to make loans, but then when the so-called nobles, right, decided that they didn't want to pay them, they just simply had a pogrom, you know, and got rid of the Jews, killed them, and killed them in horrible ways. And as far as assimilation goes, my parents tried. We had a Christmas tree. Ostensibly, it was for Mitzi, the Christian woman who took care of me. But really, it was sort of the trappings of assimilation, and it did absolutely no good. On Kristallnacht, a gang of Gestapo men came to our home, dragged my father off, and I witnessed cruelty, I mean real cruelty as a young child, but I also witnessed something else, and it's directly related to this. It's what I call spiritual courage. And my mother displayed that courage. She could have been killed. Many Jewish people were murdered that night. But she recognized one of the Nazis as a young man, an Austrian, of course, who had been an errand boy for the family business, and she got furious. She said, "How dare you do this to this man who has been so kind to you?" And by a miracle, whether it was that this authoritarian personality, that's what I call the domination personality, responds to authority, or who knows what, but she was spared. Of course, some money eventually passed hands, and my father was released with a safe conduct, like that my mother obtained, because they came many times. And we escaped. Had she not done that, we, like so many other Jewish families whose men were first, of course, taken away, would have stayed, and we would eventually, too, have ended up probably in a Nazi death camp. So this in-group versus out-group thinking, which is really a Western disease, but now is becoming a global disease because of the foundation of the State of Israel, which was a direct response to these persecutions. I mean, there was nowhere to go. There was nothing, no protection. I mean, why do we celebrate the righteous? Because they were a handful comparatively of people who did not either stand by or actively, as happened all over, you know, whether it was the Austrian young man who came to our home, or whether it was Poles who actually killed Jews, who managed to somehow survive and return. If they were infected by this in-group versus out-group thinking. And as I will return to, because we are going to talk as to why can people be so cruel? How does this happen? It really animated my research and my life.
Mm-hmm. And the in-group versus out-group is still going on today. I know, Hannah, you mentioned to me before about the anti-Muslim sentiment that is in post-Brexit UK right now. Can you talk a little bit about that and what parallels?
Yeah, of course. So kind of concerning racial issues in England after Brexit, which is obviously Britain's very messy departure from the EU. It essentially divided our country 50-50 between those who voted Remain and those who voted Leave. I, as a multiculturalist, voted to Remain. But it's very important to note that in England, Brexit didn't instigate racism or xenophobia, but it definitely brought to the surface in a state-sanctioned way through the referendum. There's a much longer standing of everyday structural and institutionalized racism. But this has also been a life story for those who've experienced it. So to give an example of a young man named Camille, the son of a British Pakistani family, who's lived in Birmingham all his life before moving to Spain, said that Brexit was similar to a removal of masks in England for racist rhetoric. He said, I used to hear the stories of when my dad arrived in Britain with my grandparents, and then you realize that not that much has moved forward, end quote. So essentially what's transpired since the very ugly campaign of Brexit in the restoration of British pride is the more extreme right-wing members feel emboldened to apply their views to everyday social life. If the government condones these ideological views, then why should they keep quiet? You know, this way of thinking is becoming normalized. This is something that we're seeing with, you know, under the presidency of Donald Trump. And when we're thinking now about National Socialist Germany, it's really, there are such similar parallels. So since Brexit, really racial attacks have increased, crimes being committed by those considered to be immigrants against other British residents have become part of the campaign of widespread hate, despite being the minority. And Brexit's also made us reconsider the notion of Britishness and what it means to be British. So for me, having grown up in the 80s and 90s, brown and black citizens were part of the England that I know. But for some reason, we still have this mentality that Britain has some sense of superiority, not unsimilar to our colonialist days, especially in regards to the rest of Europe. And we also see this exclusionary xenophobic operation of England in our response to the current refugee crisis. So the low numbers of asylum seekers we've taken in compared to other European countries such as Germany, and the lack of support that they actually receive from the government when they come into the country. Thankfully, we have amazing charities working to counteract this. But for a country who during the Second World War prided itself on taking in Jewish children, we've actually not learned lessons from the past. And we need to remember this is also felt by some EU citizens who are currently living in the UK, for example, our Polish communities. And there are a lot of reasons for this. I would say that there's always been a sense of they're taking our jobs. This kind of sentiment, though untrue, has led to resentment and scapegoating, which is the phrase we've already talked about. Mm-hmm. For the economic issues in England and of our poorer areas as well. So this is kind of due to the government's lack of concern for its own deprived communities and the follow-up of our various national recessions. The Conservative government has really taken support and taken opportunities from the people who would have voted to leave the EU, and has done so in a way that then leaves immigrants and refugees open to target as a reason for this. So that's really what I would like to kind of contribute about that in the current situation here.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. It's something that we all can relate to wherever we are, whichever country we're in right now. From this topic, I'd like to stress the idea of scapegoating for further thought among the people who are watching this. And also the idea that these other countries, for instance, Poland, right now, their national narrative, and Latvia and various other countries, their narrative is that whatever atrocities were perpetrated, it was strictly the Nazis. The people in those countries had nothing to do with it. They were innocent bystanders. Later on, we're going to be talking more about narratives and how narratives maintain a domination culture. So I just want to remind people that narratives are crucial. I'd like to turn now to the nature of the Ashkenazic culture, the culture shared by most of the people targeted in the Holocaust that was nearly eradicated. Catherine, would you begin this part of the discussion?
I think the Jewish kind of concept that most Americans hold and readily recognize are, of course, Ashkenazi Jews, and we get the typical matzo balls, the distinctive dress and black hats of Hasidim, and Yiddish language and klezmer music, of course. But this, at its very base, Ashkenazim refers to Germany, and this was used in medieval rabbinical literature. And the earliest Jewish settlers of Western Germany are where this term kind of comes from. However, in about the early 17th century, these groups broke apart, and some Ashkenazim moved into the territories of the Polish Commonwealth and Bohemia. And the Ashkenazi that remained in Germany were the ones involved in the Haskalah, and I think the prominent name, and also connected to music is Moses Mendelssohn. And this is a really interesting case study because you see the Jews that come in the Polish and Bohemian territories, and they really embrace klezmer music, and we have this notion today. But also for the Haskalah movement and then thereafter, you have a lot of Jewish musicians who are trained in the classical music traditions. And you see an emergence of persecution to both parties, those of the klezmer music and of the Western classical tradition, that emerges at the earliest, it's always been there, but of course in the end of the 19th century, you get this a lot with Gustav Mahler, who is referred to as critics as having a distinctly Yiddish sound despite his full-blown symphonies. And also Gustav Mahler and Felix Mendelssohn Bartholdy, who were trained and contributed to the German canon. They were both banned during the Nazi era. But for klezmer music specifically, I think it's important to know that this is not just a Jewish phenomenon, and that the music really derives from influences of multitude of sources. You have musical traditions from Romania, Greece, and various forms of Slavic folk and Balkan music, in addition to the music of the Romani. But klezmer music also had a very prominent role in Jewish culture of the Ashkenazi, particularly in the wedding. And it's really interesting to note that the wide array of musicalness that klezmer has, from any type of music, slow or fast, or what maybe just an average listener would mark as sad or happy, it actually, you could hear any of those musics in one day at a Jewish wedding. And this kind of derives from the need that this was an event that really marked this transition in life. And so you have all these different forms. But of course, you have all of these types of music, this wide variety, and they were all persecuted with the Nazis. And I think one of the most prime, of course, is Arnold Schoonberg and his 8-tone and serialism. And then he came to the US as well. And so it begs the question, what is Jewish music exactly? And even though these were all Ashkenazic individuals, of course, it's very diverse and broad.
Can you just briefly explain more for our listeners about what the Haskalah movement was? It has to do with assimilation and secularism.
Yeah, certainly, and I think maybe someone else could add to this and contribute more, but the Haskalah movement is really referred to as the Jewish form of enlightenment, and it is associated with Moses Mendelssohn. And I know one of the primary aspects of the Haskalah movement was to transition the religious services and the religious language into the colloquial language of German. And so it takes this element of that you really truly are assimilating, and you are a German Jew instead of a Jewish German.
And my understanding is that this movement, in addition to just feeling inspired, also they felt that they would be safe because they were assimilated, and it didn't turn out that way. It didn't help them at all. So I'd like to move on to, before we do, I'd like to ask, is it overstating the case to say that the righteous who saved people during the Holocaust helped preserve a culture that otherwise may have been totally eradicated? Is that too much of an overstatement, or is there truth in that?
I think specifically, I wouldn't say it's an overstatement. I think it definitely played a part, and culture has been preserved, and music and genres due to that. However, I think largely the reemergence of klezmer music specifically, and maybe others can talk about elements that aren't specifically to do with music, but that is a combination of both Jewish immigrants and individuals and the righteous to kind of have this revival movement in the 50s and 60s. You didn't get that right away after the Holocaust, and certainly those that immigrated during the war, there was sort of this notion that they didn't want to participate or perform in the traditional elements, and so it took a while for this to be revived, but certainly that wouldn't have been possible without the efforts for those who saved individuals in Europe.
Is there kind of not a backlash, but people who are more purists, do they resent the fact that so many of the people who are now maintaining klezmer culture are non-Jews?
I'm sure there is, and certainly when you go to Europe today, Ruth Gruber, she's a scholar on Jewish culture. She refers to what is going on in Europe today as a sort of virtual Jewishness. And you have multiple organizations that are dedicated to the klezmer tradition and Jewish culture, such as the Jewish Culture Festival in Krakow, Poland. But ironically, these festivals derive from organizations that are predominantly non-Jewish. And the musicians that they hire, say, are also non-Jewish musical groups. So I'm sure that there is a backlash, but between what is pure or authentic klezmer music, I think is hard to debate, all in all.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Catherine. This idea of what is authentic klezmer has historical echoes in American popular culture of the late 1800s and first part of the 1900s. Dennis, I know you had some thoughts about that. Would you like to share those with us?
Yes, another example of this musical culture was Tin Pan Alley, which rose out of Eastern European Jewish tradition. It dates from possibly 1885 to 1930, depending on your criteria, and became the popular music of America for that time. The drive for success was the need to escape the ghetto, the Lower East Side in New York. It was the same drive as the Irish, the Italians, and the Blacks. Howard Reich of the Chicago Tribune has a theory for the success of these primarily Jewish songwriters. Hunger is the motivator. Cole Porter, not Jewish, apparently told Sammy Kahn that he wished he had grown up on the Lower East Side because it would have given him that extra touch of genius to be a really great composer. This is Cole Porter we're talking about, one of the greats of that era. Examples of Jewish songwriters from that era include George and Ira Gershwin, Irving Berlin, Harold Arlen. Both of those, Berlin and Arlen, were sons of cantors. Jerome Kern, Sammy Kahn, Richard Rogers, Harold Rome. The secrets of these writers seem to include borrowing from the wealth of Yiddish music and many other ethnicities.
Well, moving on then to how this all happened and the environment in which it happened. The milieu in which the Holocaust took place, in which the unbelievable was allowed to happen, was the sociocultural structure of Nazism. Rian, will you share your knowledge about structures like this and how the actions of the righteous were countercultural?
I will. I want to add something to what Catherine said, which is that music was really a very important tradition in Jewish life. I mean, my father would sing Mein Städtele Belz. And, he loved to sing, and he would sing these old songs that were carried on from one generation to the next. But at the same time, my parents both functioned, without the, quote, traditional, well, they weren't traditional. I mean, the hi-hat and the black coat, I mean, those were adopted from, 18th and 19th century customs. So it's kind of a mishmash. But let me get into the question that you asked. You just reminded me of my father singing, and that it is a powerful memory from even in our years of exile, which, I mean, I was lucky in a sense to be an outsider. I'm going to start with that, because my work really goes beyond conventional thinking. And I'll just go right into that, if I may. I try to answer these questions of my childhood. Why, when we humans have such an enormous capacity for consciousness, for caring, as I saw with my mother and her courage in standing up to injustice out of love, why has there been so much cruelty, so much insensitivity, so much destructiveness? And years later, of course, I finally, after many life experiences and educational experiences, etc., I set out to answer those questions. And I discovered right away that if I was stuck in the conventional social categories, like right versus left, or religious versus secular, or Eastern versus Western, or Northern versus Southern, I could not answer the question, which is fundamental: what kind of society supports the expression of these positive human capacities, rather than, because we also have those, our negative capacities for cruelty, for destructiveness, for violence. Because for one thing, there have been repressive, violent regimes in every one of our conventional categories. But for another, and this really came, I won't go into my life experiences, out of a realization that we have really, in our analysis of society, as well as in our social categories, they actually marginalize and even ignore the majority of humanity, women and children. And that was major. So I have introduced two new social categories, what I call the domination configuration and the partnership configuration. And of course, it's a social scale. It's always a matter of degree. And in my most recent book that was published last year by Oxford University Press, Nurturing Our Humanity, I take this down to what I call the biocultural partnership domination lens. And what we see through this lens is that there is a really integral relationship between what is basically marginalized or ignored in sociology, political science, economics, in what we are taught as important knowledge or truth, between, yes, what happens to the majority of humanity, women and children, and whether a society is more equitable or inequitable, whether it's characterized by in-group versus out-group thinking or scapegoating, as Marty said, whether it is more warlike or more peaceful. And you can't see that if you, I mean, linguistic psychologists have long told us that the conventional, the categories provided by a language channel our thinking. So it's almost impossible, if we stay stuck in those categories, to really see other alternatives. So this leads directly to your question, Marty, because much of Europe through the millennia, and this was particularly true, I think, in Germany, in Poland certainly, in Austria, oriented more to the domination and the partnership side, starting with the family. And it's very instructive, and I'm jumping ahead a little bit, that when the Hollanders did their famous study of exactly the people you call the righteous, the people who risked their lives and the lives of their families, I might add, dispelling this whole notion of selfish genes, because, you know, they would all have been wiped out, right? To save Jews. They all almost unanimously said that they came from families that were not the norm. They came from families that were, in terms of this conceptual framework, more partnership oriented, where yes, parents, I mean, we need parents, we need teachers, we need managers, leaders, but they were more authoritative rather than authoritarian. They did not use violence against them, and they modeled as well as taught relations of empathy, of caring. And this, I think, is something that we really have to, jumping to our present time, take very much to heart. Because when I studied what was happening in the United States, for example, I saw that the people pushing us back spent enormous energy, money, resources, time in pushing back the normative ideal for a family, so that at a certain point there was a survey asking people, is the father the master of the house? Do you agree? And it increased rather than decreased during those years when the so-called rightist fundamentalist alliance, which is really a domination alliance, first came together in the United States and subsequent years. And we have been seeing a backlash, a move back to this normative ideal. And really, people who are brought up with this normative ideal will actually see, quote, strong man rule, male dominance, which is the first in-group versus out-group, you know, the in-group of mankind and the female other, as normal, as natural. And they will vote for, quote, strong man leaders. So to conclude, and this is all brought out in Nurturing Our Humanity in my most recent book, one of the commonalities of people who voted for President Trump in the United States seems to have been this really background of that kind of family, that kind of worldview, and yes, a view of our species in which the in-group of mankind, if you will, is to rule over the female other, which of course then can be applied to racism, to anti-Semitism, to any ism, to any ugly ism. We have to see connections if we're going to change things. And that's why in my work, I have proposed, taking into account findings from neuroscience, okay, that we must pay attention to foundations such as childhood and gender if we are going to avoid these regressions, as not only we saw in the Holocaust, but we're seeing worldwide today, whether it's totalitarian, that's secular, or whether it's so-called religious fundamentalism, which is really domination fundamentalism, where a top priority is maintaining or returning to a, quote, traditional family, which is code for authoritarian, rigidly male-dominated, and highly punitive family.
Well, thank you, Rian, for that wonderful summary. And the part of your concept, your theory of partnership and domination that resonates so much for me is that it is in fact a continuum. And this is going to lead us to our final topic where Hannah is going to talk about allyship. When you read the stories of the Holocaust or hear the stories of the righteous among the nations who saved people during the Holocaust, some people may think that these were a small handful of individuals who did all the brave things at great risk to themselves. So you either did that or you stood by and did nothing. When in fact, there was a whole continuum of people helping in to whatever extent they could. In the family that I profile, it was a village in the Netherlands where the particular family took great risks and expended many resources to save Jewish lives. But the fact was that the whole town knew what was going on and nobody ever told, even though if they had told, they were risking their lives. So for many people, they did what they could, even if it meant only keeping silent instead of speaking out when they could have threatened someone that way. So I'd like to move then to the present day and the concept of allyship, because we can begin to visualize the ways in which the actions of the righteous are relevant in our time through this lens. So Hannah, can you share your learnings about this?
Yeah, of course. So in my study of Sobibor, it's been a very interesting one to research in terms of the righteous among the nations and what it really meant to be an active participant in the rescue of Jews. Because it really, this kind of micro-historical example and case study really shows both extremes, and the importance of the issue of localized actions during the Holocaust in the wider Polish Jewish Holocaust memory. So obviously, as we've mentioned, the current right-wing government is using the righteous as a political tool. But it's really important to remember that these different aspects of humanitarian narratives within the memory of the Shoah and the importance of individual stories. In this, there's a lot of gray area, particularly considering the notion of bystander, which Marta, you just mentioned. It's really not so black and white. Those who help Jews also often receive some form of compensation. So for instance, monetary gain. These are really important factors to remember when we're thinking about the rescue of Jews in the Holocaust. So Sobibor is a very interesting example, as I mentioned. It was a camp that was established in Eastern Poland specifically for the purpose of killing Jews in the general government. So that's the part of occupied Poland, not directly annexed to Germany. So between 1942 and 1943, approximately 180,000 Jews were killed at Sobibor before the prisoner uprising, which was led by Jewish resistance members in the camp and aided by a convoy of Soviet Jewish POWs. Who brought with them military expertise. So the Sobibor uprising was one of the most successful escapes of the Second World War. Around 300 forced laborers escaped. However, only 48, approximately 48, actually made it to see the end of the war. This is important because after their escape, all of them faced their own experiences of survival. So some received help from local Poles, whereas others were actually even killed by local Poles who were aiding the Nazis in their manhunt. So they were looking for these escapees. So just to give you a couple of specific examples, there was a couple who met in Sobibor, Selma and Haim Engel. So Haim was a Polish Jew, Selma was Dutch. Now they were hidden, so after their escape from Sobibor, they were hidden in a barn by a couple named Adam and Setka Novak. We know about their experiences because Selma actually wrote a diary when she was in hiding. She was pregnant during this time, and they had a really interesting relationship with their rescuers. So when they escaped from Sobibor, they took with them gold and jewelry that they had access to because they were sorting through the belongings of Jews who had been sent to Sobibor. And there's this really interesting tension between the kind of anti-Semitic attitude that Setka has towards Selma, and she writes about this in her diary. But at the end of the day, they risked their lives for them. And later on in her life, Selma really reflected on the gravity of their sacrifice. And the family stayed in touch. So the Engels would send the Novaks money. And, you know, they were very poor farmers living in rural East Poland. So it's really important to understand the kind of deeper nature of the righteous and the human emotions that go with it. Another interesting story that doesn't directly involve the uprising. We have Yosef and Jenny Kopf. So this really opened up the debate again in Poland about the righteous and also the kind of the avoidance of wanting to blame Poles for having any kind of complicity in the Holocaust. So this brother and sister, Josef was sent to Sobibor, but he actually escaped prior to the main camp uprising with a co-worker after they killed a Ukrainian guard who had taken them out of the camp. So Josef went to find Genia. Genia was being hidden by a local Pole, Antek Teklak. So when he escaped from Sobibor, he went to find her. And coming towards the end of the war, Josef then asserted that he'd traveled back to their local hometown in Poland to get some help from the local villagers who'd known the Kopp family. And he was never seen again. And local witnesses detailed that he was actually killed by the locals and buried in a nearby field. The family are now in the process of trying to locate his remains. So on the one hand, we have the story of Genia, who was successfully hidden. She was hidden in a sort of small hole in the ground. So Teklak, her rescuer, really risked the execution of his entire family. But on the other hand, we have the direct killing of Josef by local Poles. Really, in this one family example, we have this complete divide of savior and perpetrator, and there's no in between. You know, Poland has 6,706 righteous among the nations, and this is really the highest number of any country. But as we see in the case of Sobibor and the examples I've given you, there was also betrayal, murder, and anti-Semitic attitudes. And I think especially in the wake of Poland's controversial Holocaust law, which Marty just alluded to, it's really important that both sides of these stories are told, I think, in the present day.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Thank you, Hannah. There are so many complex and compelling stories. Some are well known and others we need to learn more about, as Gitl said in her welcome, to create a web of deeper understanding, intersecting ideas and nuance, which we can all ponder. That's what she said. Dennis, I know that as a Unitarian, you have some deeper knowledge about that aspect of the Holocaust, and also some ideas about our attitudes toward differences, which is one of the driving forces that powered the Holocaust.
There is a special link for me in this struggle against the Nazis, not me personally, but with my church. The chalice, the symbol of Unitarian Universalism, developed in World War II. Unitarians were another group persecuted by the Nazis, and the chalice became a symbol for the underground, helping Jews and others, including Unitarians, to escape. By the way, there's a really fascinating and heart-wrenching Ken Burns documentary from 2016, Defying the Nazis, The Sharps War. It played on PBS and is still available on DVD. It chronicles Wait Still and Martha Sharp, Unitarians rescuing Jews and others from the Nazis. Just as a side note, if I had to pick two Jewish individuals who had the most influence on the world over the centuries, my choices, now these are just my choices, would be Baruch Spinoza and Theodor Herzl. Spinoza led the way in the Age of Reason. His dates are 1632 to 1677, with his Tractatus Theologico Politicus and his major work, Ethics. Not enough time to explain further, unfortunately. And Herzl wrote Der Judenstaat, or the Jewish State, in 1896, pointing the way to the modern state of Israel 50 years before it happened. His book was essentially the blueprint. Now, notice I said most influence. I didn't say best influence. My personal feeling is that Spinoza had a very positive influence on philosophy and religion for the next centuries, especially regarding the role of God in the world, especially in Judaism. Herzl, on the other hand, his contribution is hotly debated. Again, too much to go into here, but you might want to check him out. What is the cause of all the hatred and torment of Jews? Why Jews for longer term and more consistently than any other religion? I'd like to submit this for consideration. Jews have maintained a difference from their surrounding cultures, a difference in dress, usually a difference in language, and a strong emphasis on education, even when the surrounding culture did not. but more importantly, a difference in religious practice and a difference in what that practice says. The religion has expressed a special relationship with God, a covenant. That combination of circumstances and practices has set the Jewish people apart, giving a difference from the main culture at whatever location or time. And there are few cultures now or in the past which celebrate differences between people. Those differences are taken rather as threats to be eliminated. This extends from the playground bully going after someone who's a little different, I know this one well, to a leader of a nation restricting immigration because we don't want to be contaminated with those people taking our jobs from us. Sound familiar? Jews, Muslims, Sikhs, Buddhists, indigenous peoples, Blacks, Asians, Latinos, women, LGBTQ. We're back in an era where all are discriminated against in a white privileged society. And all of these people are in need of allies. Are we up to the task of being those allies in this present day, the righteous among the nations? That's our question.
When we draw comparisons between the righteous that were documented and the many righteous who are not known to anyone except the people that they saved, to what we can do today in our present dire situations that we've described, specifically in the UK and here in the United States, I'd like to ask each of you to share for perhaps 3 minutes your thoughts. I'll just go alphabetically. Your thoughts on how we can emulate the righteous in what we do today in this day and age in the areas where we find ourselves. So I'd like to start with Rian.
I think that what we're seeing play out today, whether it is in the xenophobia in the United States, in the Holocaust denial, on the one hand, is really the struggle between these two models within, whether it's Eastern, Western, Northern, Southern, because, it can be, I mean, you want to talk about in-group versus out-group thinking. Think of the Middle East, Shia versus Sunni, Sunni versus Shia. And not coincidentally, these are cultures where, yes, the normative ideal for family is a domination ideal. It's changing thanks to Muslims themselves, especially women who are saying, wait, this is wrong. We want to change it. I think that what we have to do is speak out. This is, to me, one of the major lessons from the Holocaust. In between the righteous who actually risk their lives for whatever reason and the lives of their families, and those who actively were complicit or actually did kill, turn in, whatever, directly or indirectly, Jews, Romas, etc., is a huge spectrum of people who did nothing, but who were infected by the in-group versus out-group thinking, by, as Dennis so eloquently mentioned, I mean, anti-Semitism goes back really to the early days of the then Catholic Church, basically against a, quote, competing, I mean, the early Christians were Jews. Jesus was a Jew. So they had to, they thought, vilify this out-group. And that became a tradition, which, as I said, is now being magnified not only in the West. I mean, when Hannah spoke about what's happening, in Britain, anti-Semitism and violent anti-Semitism is rising all over Europe, the United States. but it's only part of this in-group versus out-group thinking. I mean, think of the massacres of Hindus and Muslims, and I mean, it's a mess, isn't it? Or the Rwandan genocide. So what we really have to do are two things, I think. One, speak out. But secondly, work on these four cornerstones that I've proposed of childhood, because we know from neuroscience that what children first observe and experience actually impacts nothing less than how our brains develop, especially in our early years. So what does that mean? How we think, how we feel, whether there is climate change denial, whether there is denial of COVID-19. This is all part of the crazy family dynamic that happens in these kinds of domination-oriented families where where caring and coercion are conflated. Okay.
I'd like to say that we're going to have a reference list at the end, and among those references will be Rian's book that explain the partnership domination continuum and the four foundations upon which these societies maintain each other. So I really encourage everyone to look at those resources. So Catherine, can you share what you would like people to do about what we've talked about?
Yes, of course. And I think I definitely can only re-articulate what Rian said and to speak out when you see injustice. But I think another thing, particularly in America, what we can do is listen and hold conversation. And I don't mean the sort of conversation where you're talking at each other, but where you truly sit down and you're honestly taking in another person's opinion. I'm thinking right now, particularly, I mean, those of us from the Twin Cities, we've witnessed and experienced the Black Lives Matter and the aftermath of George Floyd's murder. I had to slam my windows down to avoid getting tear gas in my apartment, and buildings were burning just 2 blocks up. But I think, you know, this is just a small thing that I experienced compared to what Black Americans experience their entire lives and the systemic racism. And I think that we all need to listen when people are saying that this injustice is happening, and we need to be, you know, sometimes it's not our spot, our place to speak out, but it is our place to support others while they are speaking out, and to just, you know, be compassionate and be a good human, I think is most important. But really to listen and hold conversation and to challenge what you see as wrong.
Thank you, Catherine. Dennis, what can you add to this?
Well, there's so many opportunities all over the world. And the problem is that groups of people that operate as partnership groups, like the Yanomami in northern Brazil, they're in the tropical forests and want no contact with anyone else, but they don't have leaders. Their groups, their tribes are will decide within the tribe what the next appropriate thing is to happen without having a leader strong arm them. But they're in the midst of being attacked by hunters and gold miners and others who are burning the forest and making prostitutes of the women, and just dealing with, it's a matter of the culture, of the two cultures clashing, with one being a dominance-based culture and the other partnership-based. And partnership-based seems to lose all the time in those clashes. But there are Inuit communities who are flailing and faltering because of climate change. They're sinking in the permafrost, and the food that they hunt is disappearing. And then in our local communities, again, as Catherine was talking about, the Blacks, the Hispanics, the LGBTQA+, all are being attacked by the dominance view.
endangered. And so just being conscious, being aware of the Yanomami and the Inuit and what's happening in our own communities is the first step. Would you say just informing yourself and being more aware of all that?
Education based on reliable sources. That's the
Amen.
big problem now.
Yes, amen to that. Well, thank you, Dennis. Hannah, can you round this out for us?
Of course. So, you know, unfortunately, the global slogan for the Holocaust was never again. This has never been realized. Genocide is still taking place. We see it every day on the news. Really, you need to educate yourself on what's happening in the world at the minute, and also think, so what can we do? You know, act within your means. If this means protesting, if this means petition signing, donating, volunteering, small acts do matter. And I think this is really important to remember, especially for us in the UK when we're really missing the support of our government. These local initiatives and individual organizations are just so great and doing such good work. They are really the people that you should be giving your time to. As Catherine said, just be kind, be wary of the struggles of others. And, you know, as a historian, I would also say to study the past and make these extraordinary stories that we've talked about and that we've watched in the film more available to the wider public. And, you know, to celebrate multiculturalism. We see this with the Jewish, you know, reprisal and the celebration of klezmer music and Jewish culture. Really, this is what we need to be doing, is putting a positive light on the amazing things that multiculturalism brings to us, and never to forget that. So I think that would probably be my advice.
That's your takeaway. Well, thank you so much, Hannah. So this ends our panel of scholars discussion, but we hope that for all who've experienced this, it's only the beginning of a deeper understanding of the events and actions it depicts and their relevance today. This recorded panel discussion is intended to be used with the Garden of the Righteous documentary video, and it's most useful if you view the documentary first. At the end of this discussion video, there's going to be an extensive reference list for further study. Please consider printing it, saving it, and using the rich resources that it offers. In closing, I'd like to share with you an updated version of the last few words of our published article, Righteous Among the Nations, Music Without Borders. Would I be willing to sacrifice my own safety, possibly my life, for the lives of others? Not only my life, but the lives of my family members and friends? We hope that no one watching the Garden of the Righteous documentary and this panel of scholars discussion will ever have to answer that question. But there is another question: what can I as an individual do? Here are some answers. Reject white supremacy, paternalism, anti-Semitism, and hegemony. Join with others in action. Support contemporary exemplary groups and individuals, and honor those from the past who lived righteously. Thank you, and shalom.